And this king had everything you could ever dream of and want. Except he didn't have the one thing he wanted more than anything. He wanted a baby. But no matter how much he and the Queen tried, he couldn't have one. So eventually he took drastic action. He went deep into the dark, dark woods, and he knocked on the door of the dark, dark fairy. And the door opened, and there she was.
"Oh, your Highness! What a pleasant surprise! Do come in."
Now the dark fairy was lonely in the woods, and she was so pleased to have a visitor that she agreed to everything he asked, without really thinking it through.
"Your wish is my command."
And 9 months later, a baby girl was born. Now the dark fairy sat in her house and waited, and waited, and waited a little bit more for the invitation to arrive. But it never came.
"Oh, well, it must have got lost in the post. I'll just go and see how the little darling's doing."
So she popped to a shop, she bought the baby a teddy bear, and she made her way to the castle. Now when she got to the castle, it was buzzing with people everywhere. And there seemed to be a long line of people all waiting to go in. She joined the line, and when she got to the front, there was a big, strong bouncer there.
You're not invited. Your name's not on the list, so you can't come in," he said.
And the poor fairy said,
"Oh, no, there must be some mistake. I'm sure the king meant to invite me."
and he looked again, but
"No, you're not invited. Go away, we don't want you here."
Now the poor fairy, at first she was upset, and one tear just fell from her eye. And when she saw that tear, she began to feel angry. And her upset turned red inside her, and she began to feel the rage bubbling.
"I'll show them," she said.
And with a huge cloud of wind behind her, she burst into the room where the baby was being christened. All around the room were other fairies who had given the young baby gifts. The baby had been given the gift of good looks, the gift of good nature, and the gift of grace.
"I'll give her a gift," said the fairy. 17 years of life for this girl, and then she'll mount the stairs that twirl. A life for a life, that is the way. That girl will die on her 17th birthday."
And with a huge crash and a bang, the dark fairy disappeared. Now the place went into chaos, the king and the queen screaming and ranting, trying to get her back, but no one could find her. And then the king shouted, "Can anyone do anything?" And there was one fairy that had still not given her gift to the princess. Now this young fairy was very new and very nervous. She had been going to give the young princess the gift of song, a beautiful singing voice, and she had spent many, many days perfecting the spell. But everyone turned to stare at her.
"Oh, I'll give it a go."
So she closed her eyes tight, and she began to muster a spell from deep within herself. And this spell came out: "Princess Dawn, on your 17th birthday, not dead but asleep you shall lay, for 100 years of sleep-filled bliss, until awoken by true love's kiss." Ta-da! And everybody applauded, except the king and the queen.
100 years?
The king said.
What good is that? I'll be dead. We'll be dead. Get out of my kingdom.
And the poor young fairy flew off in a fluster. 17 years passed, and Dawn turned into a beautiful, good-natured, graceful young lady. She couldn't sing, but she was really, really excited, because the next day was her 17th birthday. She went to see her father. "Oh, Daddy, what have you got me this year? Is it another pony? Is it a car? Is it a huge princess mansion, all of my own?" But instead of looking at her with a smile, her father turned to her with a glare.
"Dawn, you're not having a birthday this year. Go to your room."
And poor Dawn, who had never heard an angry word from her father in her whole life, began to cry. And she went back to her room and she cried and she cried and she cried, until suddenly she had an idea. Oh, silly Daddy, he's joking, of course. He must have got me something really, really special. And as the sun began to come up on the 17th birthday of young Dawn, she got out of bed and she began to wander around the house searching for her secret present. And as she went from room to room, she started to hear a faint sound in her ear. Dawn, Dawn. And it was almost like it was pulling her in a new direction. And she found a part of the castle that she had never seen before. Dawn, Dawn. It took her all the way to a spiral staircase. She had never seen it before, and she found herself going up that twirly, swirly staircase until she got to the top where there was a door, and she continued to hear that voice, Dawn, this way, your presence. So she opened the door, and inside she saw something the likes of which she had never seen before. A huge wheel that was spinning around and around and around, and she could still hear that voice, Dawn, it's yours, touch it. And in the middle of the wheel was the needle, and it was all shiny and glimmery, and Dawn couldn't help but put her hand out and touch it, and a little drop of blood came off her finger, and suddenly she felt really, really, really sleepy. And just like that, Dawn fell asleep. Now, do you remember the young fairy who had cast the spell many, many years ago, who had been outcast by the king? Well, she hadn't left. She came back then and there, and she saw Dawn asleep, and she made her all comfortable. And then she cast another spell over the whole castle to make every single person go to sleep. The king fell asleep, the queen fell asleep, the stable boy fell asleep, the chef fell asleep. Every single person, even the dogs and horses, were asleep. And then the fairy went outside of the castle, and she made a huge thorn bush grow. And the thorns grew up stronger and stronger and longer and thicker to make a huge forest of thorns all around the castle, so that nobody in 100 years would want to go near that castle and make a new development of property or anything like that. And then she waited. She waited for 100 years. 100 years later, a young prince was riding through the forest looking for a princess. He had been to a beach and had found a beautiful princess there, but she couldn't talk. "That's not the princess for me," he said. "I like a girl that can talk." So he carried on, and he got to a huge tower, and up that huge tower was a princess, and she had the longest hair that there ever was. But when he called up to her and said, "Hey, good looking, you looking for a prince?" she said, "Not tonight, I'm washing my hair." "Ah, you're not the princess for me then." And he carried on, and he carried on, and he found another princess. But this princess used to wear beautiful, beautiful gowns at night, but during the day she had coal all over her face and would clean up the cinders. "Ah, you're not the princess for me," he said. And he carried on, and he carried on, until he came to a huge thorn bush. And there was a fairy. "Hello, I've been waiting for you," the fairy said. And the prince turned to her and said, "Oh, are you some kind of witch? I prefer the term fairy. Now, in this castle here, there's a young princess who's been asleep for 100 years, and she's waiting for you to come and kiss her, and she will make the most beautiful, graceful, good-natured princess queen that ever there was." And the prince looked at this fairy and said, 100 years? Well, that makes her old enough to be my great-grandmother. "Well, actually no, because time has stood still. She's still no older than 17, and she's very beautiful. Did I mention that?" And the prince thought about this, and he thought, well, why not? So he took out his chainsaw, which he had in his backpack, turned it on, and he began to cut through the thorns. And he cut, and he cut, and he cut, and he thrashed at the thorns, and eventually he made his way through to the castle. But the castle was very dusty, and there was a kind of eerie silence all around it, and people asleep and snoring. That was the king. But he made his way into the castle and up a spiral staircase. And when he went into the room at the top of the spiral staircases, there he saw a huge bed. And on that bed lay the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. And he couldn't help himself. The moment he saw her, he just wanted to kiss her. So he bent down and he gave her a big kiss on the lips. And the princess went, "Oh!" And she looked into the prince's eyes and she said, "I've been dreaming about you for 100 years. And he didn't know what came over him, but he suddenly felt carried away in the moment, so he said, "Oh, sugar, you're so good looking. Will you marry me?" And the princess said, "Yes, I will." And the fairy went around the castle waking everybody up. And Princess Dawn and her new Prince Edward went to see her father. "Daddy, I'm getting married." And the king was delighted that his daughter was alive and getting married. And he said, "Well, let's celebrate, but this time I'm going to invite everybody." And so they all had a big party, and the good fairy was there, and the bad fairy was there, and the king and the queen and the princess and the prince danced and danced and danced all night, and they all lived as people do in fairy tales, happily ever after.